On a cold Texas night, a poor woman saw a shivering stranger outside her cabin. Boots worn, coat torn, and pride barely holding him upright. Without hesitation, she brought him in, set him by the fire, and offered her last bowl of soup. To her, he was just another lost soul on a long road. But weeks later, thunderous hooves returned, and that same stranger rode back, not in rags, but as the wealthiest man in Texas, ready to repay a kindness he'd never forgotten. The wind came first, not the gentle kind that whispers through grass or carries the scent of wildflowers across a valley. This wind screamed. It tore across the Texas plains like something alive, something angry, ripping at the earth with claws made of ice and fury. The sky had turned the color of old iron, and the snow fell so thick it swallowed the horizon whole. Clara stood at the window of her cabin, one hand pressed against the glass, feeling the cold seep through. The lantern on the table behind her cast her shadow long and thin across the floorboards. She'd lived alone for 3 years now. 3 winters since they'd buried Thomas beneath the cottonwood, and she'd learned to read the language of storms. This one spoke of death. She turned from the window, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The fire in the hearth crackled and popped, throwing orange light that couldn't quite reach the corners of the room. She'd stacked enough wood to last the night, filled the kettle, checked the latch on the door twice. Everything a woman alone could do to keep the wilderness outside where it belonged. That's when she heard it. A sound beneath the howl of the wind, something heavy hitting the ground near the porch. Clara froze, her breath caught somewhere between her lungs and her throat. Animals didn't move in weather like this. They burrowed deep, waited it out, trusted their instincts to survive. Only men were fool enough to fight a blizzard. She waited, listening. The wind screamed again, rattling the shutters. Then another sound, softer this time. A groan, low and broken, like something dying. Clara's hand went to the rifle above the door. Her fingers wrapped around the cold metal, and she lifted it down slowly, checking the chamber out of habit. Thomas had taught her that. Out here, he'd said, hesitation gets you killed, but so does shooting first. She moved to the door, pressed her ear against the wood. Nothing but wind. Then she heard it again. That groan, weaker now, fading into the storm. Her hand hovered over the latch. Fear told her to stay inside, to bar the door, stoke the fire, and let the storm decide who lived and who didn't. The world was full of men who'd take advantage of a woman's mercy, who'd see her kindness as weakness and her solitude as opportunity. But there was something else inside her too, something Thomas had planted before he left, a belief that the measure of a soul wasn't found in its comfort, but in what it did when no one was watching. Clara opened the door. The cold hit her like a fist. Snow whipped into the cabin, swirling around her skirts, biting at her face. She squinted against it, raising one arm to shield her eyes. The lantern light spilled out onto the porch, pushing back the darkness just enough to see. A horse stood there, its head down, steam rising from its flanks, and beside it, crumpled in the snow like a bundle of rags, was a man. He wasn't moving. Clara set the rifle against the doorframe and stepped out into the storm. The snow was already up past her ankles, and the wind tried to push her back, but she bent low and grabbed the man's arm. He was heavy, broad-shouldered, beneath a coat crusted with ice. She pulled, her boots slipping on the frozen boards, and his body shifted just enough for her to see his face. Young. Younger than she'd expected. Maybe 25, maybe less. His skin was pale, lips blue, a thin layer of frost clinging to his beard. A hat had fallen into the snow beside him, and dark hair stuck to his forehead in frozen clumps. "Come on," she muttered through gritted teeth, dragging him toward the door. "Don't you die on me now." He didn't answer, didn't even stir. But when she pressed her fingers to his neck, she felt it. Faint and slow, but there, a pulse. She hauled him over the threshold, every muscle in her back and arms screaming. The horse whinnied behind her, and she glanced back just long enough to see it turning, heading for the barn where the wind couldn't reach. Smart animal. Smarter than its rider, clearly. Clara kicked the door shut, dropped the latch, and let the man's weight fall to the floor. She stood there for a moment, panting, her hands trembling. Snow melted into dark puddles around him, and his chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. She'd just invited a stranger into her home, a man who could be anyone, could be dangerous, could be dying. But the decision was made. Clara dragged him closer to the fire, pulled off his coat and boots, and wrapped him in the quilt from her bed. His clothes were soaked through, clinging to him like a second skin. She worked quickly, her hands steady despite the fear still humming in her veins. She'd seen frostbite before. Seen men lose fingers, toes, whole limbs to the cold. If she didn't warm him soon, he wouldn't make it to morning. She built the fire higher, feeding it until the flames roared and the heat pressed against her face like a living thing. Then she went to the stove, ladling soup from the pot she'd made earlier. Carrots, potatoes, a bit of salt pork. Simple food, but warm. The kind of warmth that could pull a man back from the edge. She knelt beside him, lifting his head just enough to press the spoon to his lips. "Come on," she whispered. "Just a little." At first, nothing. Then his throat worked, swallowing once, twice. His eyes stayed closed, but his breathing deepened, and Clara felt something loosen in her chest. She fed him slowly, one spoonful at a time, watching the color creep back into his face. The firelight danced across his features, and she found herself studying him, the scar along his jawline, the calluses on his hands, the way his brow furrowed even in unconsciousness. He'd been running from something. She could see it in the way he'd ridden into a storm, in the desperation that still clung to him like the smell of smoke. Outside, the wind howled, clawing at the walls, rattling the shutters. But inside, the cabin was warm, the fire crackled, the soup steamed, and for a moment Clara let herself believe that mercy had been the right choice. She sat back on her heels, wiping her hands on her apron. The man stirred, just barely, a twitch of his fingers, a soft exhale. His eyes didn't open, but his lips moved, forming a word she couldn't hear. Clara pulled the quilt tighter around him and settled into the chair by the fire. The rifle lay across her lap just in case. She wouldn't sleep tonight. Couldn't, not with a stranger in her home. But as the hours stretched on and the storm raged outside, she found herself watching him, watching the rise and fall of his chest, watching the way the firelight softened the hard edges of his face. And she wondered who he was, what he was running from, and whether the choice she'd made tonight would save them both or destroy her. The wind screamed, the snow fell, and the fire burned on, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts across the walls. Morning would come eventually. But for now, there was only this: two souls caught in the same storm, bound together by a single act of mercy that neither of them understood yet. Clara reached for the soup again, her hands steady now, her fear tempered by something softer, something that felt almost like hope. She fed him another spoonful, and this time, his eyes fluttered, just for a second, just long enough for her to see the color, gray, like the sky before a storm. And in that brief moment their gazes met, not as savior and saved, not as stranger and host, but as two people who'd been lost in the dark and had somehow found each other by the light of a fire. His eyes closed again, and Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Outside, the storm began to ease. The wind softened to a moan, and the snow fell quieter, gentler, as if the world itself was finally ready to rest. Clara set the bowl aside and leaned back in her chair. The fire crackled, the man slept, and somewhere in the distance, the first pale light of dawn touched the horizon. She didn't know his name, didn't know his story, but she knew one thing: kindness, once given, couldn't be taken back. And whatever came next, whether it was redemption or ruin, she'd face it the same way she'd face the storm, with the door open, the fire burning, and her heart, scarred as it was, still willing to hope. When morning light broke over the frozen fields, neither of them knew that kindness had just changed the course of two lives. The world outside the cabin wore white. Snow covered everything: the fence posts, the barn roof, the skeletal branches of the cottonwood where Thomas rested. It softened the hard edges of the land, made it look clean and new, like God had taken an eraser to the past and started over. But Clara knew better. Beneath all that white was the same frozen earth, the same grief, the same loneliness. She stood at the stove, stirring oats in a pot, listening to the silence. The stranger still slept by the fire, his breathing deep, and even now, she'd checked on him twice since dawn, once to make sure he hadn't developed a fever, and once just to reassure herself he was real. He hadn't woken yet, hadn't spoken, but the color had returned to his face, and his fingers, which had been stiff and pale the night before, now curled loosely against the quilt. She ladled oats into a bowl and carried it to the table, then poured herself coffee from the pot that had been sitting on the stove since sunrise. The steam curled upward, ghostly in the cold morning light, and she wrapped her hands around the cup, letting the heat seep into her palms. Behind her, the man stirred. Clara set the cup down and turned. He was moving slowly, testing his limbs as if he didn't quite trust them yet. One hand came up to his face, rubbing at his eyes, and then he opened them. Gray, storm-colored, searching. His gaze found her immediately, and for a moment neither of them moved. He didn't speak, didn't sit up. Just watched her with the kind of wariness that comes from a life spent looking over your shoulder. Clara crossed her arms. "You're awake." His voice, when it came, was rough, scratched raw by cold and silence. "Where am I? My home." She nodded toward the window. "About 10 miles south of Stanton. You collapsed outside last night during the storm." He blinked, processing. Then his gaze shifted, taking in the cabin, the fire, the quilt wrapped around him. "You brought me in. Didn't seem right to leave you out there." He sat up slowly, wincing. His hand went to his side, pressing against his ribs, and Clara noticed the way his jaw tightened. Hurt then, but not from the cold. "Thank you," he said after a moment. The words came out stiff, like he wasn't used to saying them. Clara picked up the bowl of oats and set it on the small table beside him. "You need to eat." He looked at the bowl, then back at her. "You live here alone?" "I do." "Your husband?" "Dead." The word hung in the air between them, blunt and final. The man's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Understanding, maybe, or recognition. The kind that came from knowing what loss looked like because you'd carried it yourself. He picked up the spoon and ate slowly, each bite deliberate. Clara watched him for a moment, then turned back to the stove. She refilled her coffee, added another log to the fire, and let the silence settle. It was the kind of quiet that didn't need filling, the kind that came from two people who'd both learned that words didn't always help. When he finished, he set the bowl aside and leaned back against the wall. "I should go." "Not yet." He frowned. "Why not?" "Because the snow's still deep, your horse is half frozen, and you can barely sit up without wincing." Clara met his gaze, her voice firm. "You'll stay until you're strong enough to leave. No arguments." For a moment she thought he'd protest, but then he nodded just once and settled back into the quilt. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated. "Eli." "Eli," she repeated, testing the shape of it. "I'm Clara." He nodded again, and the silence returned. But this time, it felt different, less like the standoff it had been and more like an understanding. The days that followed moved slow as molasses. Eli healed, not quickly, but steadily. By the second day, he could walk without grimacing. By the third, he was helping her carry wood from the shed. By the fourth, he'd fixed the latch on the barn door that had been hanging crooked since last summer. He didn't talk much, worked in silence, his movements careful and precise, like a man who'd learned to be useful without being noticed. Clara didn't push. She'd lived alone long enough to know that some people wore their stories close, and prying them loose only made them retreat further. But she watched him. Watched the way he paused sometimes, staring out at the horizon like he was listening for something. Watched the way his hand went to his side when he thought she wasn't looking, pressing against a wound that wasn't from the cold. Watched the way he flinched at sudden sounds, the crack of a branch, the distant call of a hawk. He was running. That much was clear, and whatever he was running from, it wasn't far behind. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the snow in shades of gold and pink, Clara found him by the fence, hammering a loose post back into place. His breath came out in clouds, and his coat was dusted with snow, but he didn't stop until the post was steady. She walked over, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You're going to work yourself into the ground." He glanced at her, then took the cup she offered. "Better than sitting still. Why's that?" He didn't answer right away, just sipped the coffee, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Sitting still gives you time to think, and you don't want to think." "No." Clara studied him, the set of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders. "What are you running from, Eli?" His gaze snapped to hers, sharp and guarded. "Does it matter? Maybe not to you, but it matters to me. You're standing on my land, eating my food, sleeping by my fire. I think I've earned the right to know whether you're going to bring trouble to my door." For a long moment he said nothing, just stared at her, weighing something she couldn't see. Then he set the cup down on the fence post and turned away. "I made mistakes," he said quietly, "bad ones, and now I'm paying for them." "What kind of mistakes?" "The kind that get people hurt." Clara's chest tightened. "Did you hurt someone? Not the way you think." He turned back to face her, and for the first time, she saw something raw in his eyes. Something broken. "But I didn't stop it either. And that's just as bad." She didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know how to parse guilt that lived in the space between action and inaction. So she just nodded, slow and careful, and picked up her own cup. "Well," she said after a moment, "you're here now. And as long as you're here, you're not hurting anyone." He looked at her like she'd said something impossible. Like mercy was a language he'd forgotten how to speak. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. Clara met his gaze. "Because someone helped me once. When I needed it most." "Who?" "A stranger." She smiled faintly. "Guess I'm just returning the favor." Eli's jaw worked, and he looked away. But not before she saw the flicker of something in his expression. Gratitude, maybe, or shame, or both. They stood there in the fading light, the snow glowing soft around them, and Clara felt the weight of his silence settle between them like a third presence. She didn't press, didn't ask for more, because she understood what it was like to carry something too heavy to share. That night, Clara woke to the sound of movement. She sat up slowly, listening. The fire had burned low, casting only a faint glow across the cabin. Across the room, Eli's blanket was empty. She rose, pulling her shawl around her shoulders, and moved to the window. Outside, the moon hung high and full, turning the snow silver. And there, by the barn, was Eli. He was kneeling in the snow, his head bowed, one hand pressed against his chest. Clara couldn't see his face, but she could see the way his shoulders shook. Could see the way his breath came out in ragged clouds. He was crying. Clara's hand hovered over the door latch. Part of her wanted to go to him, to offer comfort the way she'd offered warmth, but another part, the part that had learned to read people the way she read storms, told her to stay inside. Some grief was too private to witness, so she stood at the window and watched him, watched the way he knelt there in the snow, clutching something she couldn't see, watched the way the moonlight painted him silver and shadow, and she wondered what ghosts he was whispering to. After a long while, he rose, wiped his face, straightened his shoulders, and walked back to the cabin. When he came inside, Clara was already back in bed, her eyes closed, her breathing slow and even. He didn't know she'd seen, didn't know she'd been watching, and she didn't tell him, because some kindnesses were best given in silence. The days stretched into a week, then two. The snow began to melt, revealing patches of brown earth and stubborn grass. The sky softened from iron to pale blue, and the air carried the first faint promise of spring. Eli stayed. He worked the land beside her, mending fences, hauling water, splitting wood. They moved in rhythm, their silence no longer awkward but comfortable. She learned the way he took his coffee. He learned the way she hummed while she cooked. Trust, fragile as it was, began to grow. But at night, Clara still heard him whispering to ghosts, still saw the way his hand went to the locket he kept tucked inside his shirt, and she knew, deep in her bones, that peace in the wilderness never lasted long, because sooner or later the past always came looking. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of distant rain. But inside the cabin, the fire still burned, the soup still simmered, and two souls, adrift in the same storm, clung to the warmth they'd found in each other. For now, it was enough. But peace in the wilderness never lasts long, and soon the tracks in the snow would lead someone back to him. Spring came slowly to the valley, like a woman testing cold water with her toes before stepping in. The snow didn't vanish overnight. It melted in patches, revealing the dark earth beneath in circles around the fence posts, in thin strips along the southern face of the barn. Icicles that had hung like crystal teeth from the cabin's eaves began to drip, their steady rhythm marking the passage of hours. By the third week, the sound of running water filled the air, creeks swelling, rivulets carving paths through the softening ground, the land waking from its long sleep. Clara stood in the doorway at dawn, watching the pale sun climb over the eastern hills. The air still held a bite, but it was different now. Not the kind of cold that promised death, but the kind that reminded you winter was losing its grip. Behind her, she heard Eli moving, the scrape of the chair, the soft thud of boots on the floorboards. He'd been up before her most mornings, feeding the fire, putting coffee on to boil. It had become their unspoken agreement. He took the early hours. She took the evenings. "Morning," he said quietly. She turned. He stood by the stove, 2 cups in his hands, steam rising between them. His face had filled out over the past weeks, the sharp edges softened by regular meals and rest. The haunted look in his eyes hadn't left entirely, but it had receded, like a wolf stepping back into the tree line. "Morning," she replied, taking the cup he offered. They drank in silence, watching the light change. Then Eli set his cup down and reached for his coat. "I'll check the fence line on the north side. Snow probably brought some posts down." Clara nodded. "I'll work the garden plot. Ground's soft enough now." He paused at the door, glancing back. "Need help?" "Not yet. Go on." He left, and Clara finished her coffee alone. Through the window, she watched him walk toward the northern pasture, his stride steady and sure. He moved differently now than he had when he'd first arrived. Less like a man bracing for a blow and more like one who'd remembered how to stand upright. She wondered how long it would last. The days took on a rhythm that felt almost sacred. Eli repaired what winter had broken, posts that had heaved out of the frozen ground, a section of the barn roof where shingles had torn loose, the chicken coop door that no longer closed properly. He worked with his hands like a man who'd learned young that labor was the only honest currency, and Clara found herself grateful for it. There was too much for one person to manage alone, and Thomas had been gone long enough that the land had started to show signs of neglect. She worked the garden, turning soil that smelled of rain and rot and promise. Her hands ached by midday, blisters forming where the hoe handle rubbed, but it was a good ache. The kind that meant something was being built, not torn down. At noon, they'd meet at the well. She'd bring bread and cheese wrapped in cloth. He'd bring water drawn fresh and cold. They'd sit on the bench Thomas had built beneath the cottonwood, eating without speaking, listening to the sounds of the valley waking up, birdsong, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through new grass. It was during one of these quiet meals that Eli finally spoke about the past. Not much. Just a fragment. "I had a brother once," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Younger than me by 3 years. Clara waited, didn't press. "He followed me everywhere. Thought I knew everything." Eli's jaw tightened. "I didn't. What happened to him?" Eli was quiet for a long time. Then he shook his head. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong choices. Clara heard the weight in those words, heard the guilt that lived beneath them like a stone at the bottom of a well. "That why you ran? Part of it? And the rest?" He looked at her then, and she saw the flicker of something raw in his eyes. "The rest is that I didn't know how to stay." She understood that, understood the way grief could make a person feel like a stranger in their own skin. How staying meant facing what you'd lost, and running meant you could pretend, just for a little while, that the past wasn't chasing you. "Well," she said quietly, "you're staying now." Eli nodded slowly. "Yeah, I am." They finished their meal in silence, and when they stood to return to work, Clara felt something shift between them. Not love, not yet, but the beginning of it. The way a seed pushes through dirt before it becomes a plant. Trust was growing, fragile and tentative, but real. Evenings were softer. After the work was done and the sun had dipped below the hills, they'd sit by the fire. Clara would mend clothes or work the loom Thomas had built for her, the rhythmic clack of the shuttle a kind of music. Eli would whittle. Small things mostly. A new handle for the paring knife, a bird for the mantle. Once, a comb, which he set on the table without a word, and which Clara picked up later, running her fingers over the smooth wood, feeling the care that had gone into each groove. He began to smile more. Not often, but enough that Clara noticed. A quick flash when the chickens escaped their coop and he had to chase them down. A slow, crooked grin when she beat him at checkers 3 games in a row. "You're hustling me," he'd said, shaking his head. "I'm a widow living alone in the middle of nowhere," she'd replied. "You think I don't know how to keep myself entertained?" He'd laughed at that, a real laugh, low and rough, like something that hadn't been used in a long time, and Clara had felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. But there were still shadows. Some nights, she'd wake to find him gone, not outside this time, but sitting by the fire, staring into the flames with a look that made her chest ache. She'd watch him from the bed, her eyes half closed, and she'd see the way his hand went to the locket he wore beneath his shirt, the way his lips moved in silence, forming words she couldn't hear. She never asked what he was saying, never pressed him to share what he wasn't ready to give, because she'd learned that healing wasn't something you could force. It came in its own time, in its own way, and all you could do was be there when it did. One afternoon they rode out to the far pasture to check on the cattle. The sky was wide and blue, stitched with thin clouds that looked like they'd been painted on. The grass had started to come in, pale green shoots pushing up through the dead stalks of last year's growth. The air smelled of earth and water and life returning. Clara rode her mare, a steady gray named Patience. Eli rode the horse that had carried him through the storm, a bay gelding with a white star on its forehead. The animal had recovered well, its ribs no longer showing, its coat glossy in the sunlight. They rode in silence, the creak of leather and the soft thud of hooves the only sounds. When they reached the pasture, they dismounted and walked the fence line, checking for breaks. The cattle grazed peacefully, unbothered by their presence. "How many head?" Eli asked. 12. Used to be more, but I sold some after Thomas died. Couldn't manage them alone." He nodded, his gaze sweeping the pasture. "You could build it back up." "With help." Clara glanced at him. "You offering?" "Maybe." It wasn't a promise, but it wasn't a refusal either. And that was something. They walked on, following the fence to the creek that marked the eastern boundary of her land. The water ran fast and clear, swollen with snowmelt, and they stopped to let the horses drink. Clara knelt by the bank, cupping water in her hands and splashing it on her face. The cold made her gasp, but it felt good. Clean. When she looked up, Eli was watching her. "What?" she asked. He shook his head. "Nothing." But there was something in his expression, something soft and uncertain, like a man realizing he'd stumbled into something he hadn't expected. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked. "This place?" "Yeah." Clara looked out at the land, the rolling hills, the wide sky, the valley that held everything she'd built and everything she'd lost. "No, this is home, even after what happened, after losing him, especially after." She met his gaze. "Running doesn't change what happened. It just means you're carrying it somewhere else." Eli was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded, slow and thoughtful. "Maybe you're right." They mounted up and rode back as the sun began its descent. The light turned golden, painting the hills in shades of amber and rust, and Clara felt something settle in her chest, something that felt almost like peace. But peace, she knew, was a fragile thing. That night, after supper, she found Eli outside again, not by the barn this time, but sitting on the porch steps, his head tilted back, staring up at the stars. She sat down beside him, pulling her shawl tight against the evening chill. "Can't sleep?" "Not yet." They sat in silence, the night alive with the sounds of insects and distant cattle. Above them, the stars burned cold and bright, scattered across the sky like salt spilled on a black table. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Eli didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was low. "About what you said earlier, about running not changing anything." "You don't believe me?" "I want to." He turned to look at her, his eyes shadowed in the dim light. "But I don't know if I can stay. Not forever." Clara's chest tightened. "Why not?" "Because the things I ran from, they don't just disappear. They follow. Then stop running. It's not that simple." "Maybe it is." She held his gaze. "Maybe you just have to decide that this is where you stop." He looked away, his jaw working. What if stopping means someone else gets hurt? What if running does? He didn't have an answer for that. They sat in silence, the weight of unspoken things pressing down between them. Clara wanted to reach out, to touch his hand, to tell him that whatever he was carrying, he didn't have to carry it alone. But she didn't. Because some battles a person had to fight for themselves. After a while, Eli stood. "I should get some sleep." "Yeah." He paused at the door, his hand on the frame. "Clara?" "Yeah?" "Thank you for letting me stay," she smiled faintly. "You're welcome, Eli." He went inside, and Clara stayed on the porch a little longer, watching the stars and listening to the night. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain still miles away. She thought about what he'd said, about the things that followed, about the impossibility of staying when you'd spent so long running, and she wondered how much time they had left before the past came looking, because it would come. She knew that now. The only question was when. Inside, the fire burned low, the cabin was warm, and for tonight, that was enough. Outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwood, rustling the new leaves like a woman murmuring prayers. And somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, soft and low, a promise of storms yet to come. Then came the riders, dust rising on the horizon like smoke from a past he thought was gone. The dust came first. Clara saw it from the garden, where she was on her knees pulling weeds from between the young potato plants. A thin line of it, rising against the blue sky like smoke from a distant fire. She straightened, wiping her hands on her apron, and watched it grow thicker. Riders. 3 of them, maybe 4. Her stomach tightened. In 3 years of living alone, she could count on one hand the number of times anyone had come out this far without warning, and none of those visits had been social. "Eli," she called, turning toward the barn. He emerged from the shadow of the doorway, a hammer in one hand. He'd been fixing the stall gate, his sleeves rolled up, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. But when he saw the dust, everything about him changed. His shoulders went rigid, his hand tightened around the hammer, and his eyes, those storm-gray eyes that had been softening over the weeks, went hard as stone. "You expecting someone?" he asked, his voice low. "No." He set the hammer down carefully, like a man trying not to startle a rattlesnake. "How far to town?" 12 miles. "How often do people come out here?" "They don't." Eli's jaw worked. He looked at the dust, then back at her, and Clara saw the calculation happening behind his eyes. "Fight or flight, stay or run." "Eli," she said carefully, "what is this?" He didn't answer, just walked toward the cabin, his stride quick and purposeful. Clara followed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Inside, he went straight for his coat, the heavy one he'd been wearing the night of the storm. He reached into the pocket and pulled out something small and folded, a piece of paper, worn soft at the creases. He unfolded it and held it out to her. Clara took it, her hands suddenly cold. It was a wanted poster. The ink was smudged, the edges torn, but the face staring back at her was unmistakable. Eli Kane, wanted for armed robbery and desertion, reward $500. She looked up at him, her throat tight. "Is this true? Some of it? Which part? The name, the robbery?" His voice was flat, stripped of emotion. "Not the desertion. I didn't run from the army, I ran from something worse." Clara's hands were shaking. She set the poster down on the table, her mind racing. $500. That was more money than most people saw in a year. Enough to make a man ride 12 miles out of his way. Enough to make him dangerous. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Would you have let me stay?" She didn't answer, couldn't, because she didn't know. Outside, the sound of hooves grew louder, closer. Eli moved to the window, peering out through the gap in the curtains. 3 men, armed. "They're not sheriffs? Bounty hunters?" "Probably." Clara's mind spun. She thought of the past weeks, the way Eli had worked beside her, fixed what was broken, smiled at her checkers jokes, the way he'd kneeled in the snow, whispering to ghosts, the way he'd looked at her last night, like a man realizing he'd found something worth staying for. And now this. "What do you want to do?" she asked. He turned to look at her, and for a moment she saw something raw and broken in his face. "I don't want to bring this to your door, Clara. You've given me more than I deserve." "That's not what I asked." The riders were close now. She could hear the creak of leather, the jingle of spurs, voices, low and rough, conferring. Eli pulled the poster from the table and shoved it back into his coat. "I'll go out, talk to them. Maybe I can—" "No." Clara moved to the door, blocking it. "You go out there alone. They'll shoot you or drag you off. Either way, you're dead. Better me than you." "That's not your choice to make." For a moment, they stared at each other. 2 people who'd found something fragile and valuable in the middle of nowhere, and who now had to decide what it was worth. Then Clara opened the door and stepped outside. The 3 men sat their horses in a loose line, their shadows stretching long across the dirt. They weren't lawmen, that much was clear. No badges, no uniforms, just hard men with harder eyes and guns strapped to their hips. The one in the middle was older, maybe 50, with a gray beard and a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. He tipped his hat when he saw Clara, but there was no warmth in the gesture. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was rough, like gravel under a wagon wheel. "Name's Cole. We're looking for a man." "Lots of men in Texas," Clara replied evenly. "You'll have to be more specific." Cole smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "This one's got a price on his head. Eli Kane. You seen him?" Clara kept her face blank. "Can't say I have." "That's so?" One of the other men spoke up, a younger one, lean and hungry looking. "Because we tracked him this way after the storm 2 weeks back. And these tracks," he gestured toward the ground, where the snow had melted to reveal hoofprints, "lead right here." Clara's pulse hammered in her ears, but she kept her voice steady. Storm brought a lot of people through. I can't account for every drifter. Cole leaned forward in his saddle, his gaze sharp. You live out here alone, ma'am? I do. No husband? No help? My husband's dead. That's hard. Cole's tone didn't soften. Makes a woman vulnerable, especially when she's sheltering criminals. Clara's hands curled into fists at her sides, but she didn't rise to the bait. I don't know who you're looking for, and I'd appreciate it if you'd move on. The third man, silent until now, spat into the dirt. She's lying, Cole. Man's here. I can feel it. Can you now? Clara's voice turned cold. Well, your feelings aren't a warrant, and this is my land. So unless you've got a legal reason to be here, I suggest you turn those horses around. Cole studied her for a long moment. Then he swung down from his saddle, slow and deliberate. The other two followed. Here's the thing, ma'am, Cole said, walking toward her. We don't need a warrant. We've got something better. We've got a man who's wanted, dead or alive. And if he's here, and I think he is, then you're harboring a fugitive, which makes you complicit. Clara stood her ground. You've got no proof. Don't need proof. Just suspicion. Cole stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his breath. Now, you seem like a decent woman, so I'm going to give you a choice. You tell us where Kane is, we take him, and you walk away clean. Or you keep lying, and we search this place top to bottom. And if we find him, well, things might get messy. Behind her, Clara heard the cabin door creak open. That won't be necessary, Eli said. She turned. He stood in the doorway, his hands raised, his face calm, but there was something in his eyes, something resigned and weary, like a man who'd been running so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stop. Eli, don't. It's all right, Clara. He stepped down from the porch, moving slowly. I'm Eli Kane. You found who you're looking for. Cole's smile widened. Well now, that's more like it. The two younger men moved forward, hands going to their guns, but Eli didn't flinch. He just stood there, his gaze steady, like a man facing a firing squad. Wait, Clara said, stepping between them. You're not taking him. Cole's smile faded. Ma'am, I don't think you understand. I understand perfectly. You're bounty hunters. You want your money. But you're not taking him. Clara, stop, Eli said quietly. She ignored him. This man didn't hurt anyone. He's been here for weeks, working my land, fixing what's broken. Whatever he did before, he's paying for it now. Paying? The younger man laughed. Lady, he robbed a bank, took $3,000 and left two men bleeding on the floor. Clara's breath caught. She turned to look at Eli, and she saw the truth in his face, saw the shame and the guilt and the weight of something he'd been carrying for too long. That true? She asked. Eli's jaw tightened. Yeah, it's true. Anyone die? No. Then it's not murder, it's robbery, and robbery can be repaid. Cole snorted. With what? You got $3,000 hidden under your floorboards? No, but he's got time. He's got hands. He can work it off. That's not how justice works, ma'am. Justice. Clara's voice turned sharp. You don't care about justice. You care about that reward money. Well, I'm telling you, you are not getting it. Not today. Cole's expression hardened. You're making a mistake, maybe, but it's mine to make. For a moment, the world held its breath. The wind had died. The sky was still. Even the birds had gone quiet, as if the valley itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Then Cole reached for his gun. Clara didn't think. She just moved, stepped forward, putting herself between Eli and the barrel of Cole's pistol. You shoot him, she said, her voice low and steady. You go through me first. Cole froze. His eyes narrowed. You willing to die for a man you've known 2 weeks? I'm willing to die for what's right. The silence stretched, taut as a wire. Clara's heart slammed against her ribs, but she didn't move, didn't blink. Behind Cole, the two younger men shifted uneasily. One of them muttered something under his breath. The other looked away. Finally, Cole lowered his gun, but the look he gave Clara was cold enough to freeze blood. This isn't over, he said. You're making an enemy, ma'am. And out here, that's a dangerous thing to do. Then I'll take my chances. Cole holstered his pistol and swung back onto his horse. The other two followed, their faces hard. They turned their mounts and rode off, the dust rising behind them like a ghost. Clara stood in the yard, her legs shaking, her breath coming fast and shallow. She didn't move until the dust had faded, and the riders were nothing but dark specks on the horizon. Then she turned to Eli. He was staring at her, his face pale, his eyes wide with something that looked like disbelief. "Why did you do that?" he asked. Clara's hands were trembling. She pressed them against her sides to still them. "Because you're not the man on that poster anymore. You don't know that." "Yes, I do." Eli shook his head, his jaw working. "Clara, you shouldn't have. They'll come back. They'll bring others. And when they do, then we'll deal with it." "We?" He stepped closer, his voice low and urgent. "There is no we. I'm leaving. Tonight. I won't let you risk your life for me." "Too late," Clara said. "I already did." For a moment they stood there in the dirt, two people bound by a choice that couldn't be undone. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the smell of rain. Eli's expression cracked. "Why?" he asked again, his voice breaking. "Why would you do that for me?" Clara looked at him, really looked. At the scars on his hands from hard work, at the guilt in his eyes that was slowly being replaced by something softer, at the man he was becoming, piece by piece, day by day. "Because mercy doesn't count the cost," she said quietly. "It just gives—" Eli's throat worked. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. And for the first time since the storm, Clara saw tears in his eyes. He turned away, his shoulders shaking. And Clara let him. Because some things were too big for words. That night the rain came. It started as a whisper, soft drops against the roof, tapping like fingers on glass. Then it grew, drumming harder, filling the air with the smell of wet earth and new growth. Inside the cabin, Clara sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Eli sat across from her, his hands folded, his face drawn. They hadn't spoken since the riders left, hadn't needed to. Finally, Eli broke the silence. "I should tell you everything," he said. Clara looked up. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." So he told her about the robbery, about his brother who'd been killed in a shootout 6 months later, about the guilt that had driven him to run, the shame that had followed him across 3 states, about the night of the storm, when he'd been so tired of running that he'd nearly let the cold take him. And Clara listened, didn't interrupt, didn't judge, just listened the way Thomas had taught her, with her whole heart. When Eli finished, the fire had burned low. The rain still fell, steady and soft. "I don't deserve what you did for me today," he said quietly. "Maybe not," Clara replied. "But you're going to—" He looked at her, confused. "You're going to stay," she said. "You're going to work this land. You're going to earn back what you took. And you're going to prove, to yourself and to everyone else, that you're more than the worst thing you've ever done." Eli's jaw trembled. "And if they come back, then we'll face them together." For a long moment he just stared at her. Then slowly he nodded. Outside, the rain fell harder, washing the dust from the earth, washing away the tracks, washing clean the past, one drop at a time. And inside, by the light of a dying fire, 2 people who'd been lost in the same storm found something neither of them had expected: hope. That night the wind returned, howling through empty doorways, and the fire she'd kept for him burned low. The town learned quickly. Clara didn't know how. Maybe Cole had talked. Maybe someone had seen the riders leaving her land and put the pieces together. Maybe it was just the way small places worked. Rumors traveling faster than truth, spreading like wildfire through dry grass. All she knew was that by the time she rode into Stanton for supplies 3 days later, the world had changed. She felt it the moment she tied Patience to the hitching post outside Miller's general store. Felt it in the way conversations stopped when she stepped onto the boardwalk. In the way eyes turned toward her, then quickly away. In the silence that followed her like a shadow. Clara kept her head up and walked inside. The store smelled the way it always did, of flour and leather and coffee beans, but Mr. Miller, who'd always greeted her with a smile and a kind word about the weather, didn't look up from his ledger when she entered. "Morning, Mr. Miller," she said. He grunted, didn't meet her eyes. Clara moved down the aisles, gathering what she needed: salt, sugar, a bag of cornmeal, lamp oil. The familiar routine of it should have been comforting, but her hands shook as she set each item on the counter. Miller tallied the cost in silence, his mouth pressed into a thin line. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold. "That'll be $4. Clara blinked. "4? Last month it was $2.50 for the same order. Prices went up. That much?" Miller's eyes finally met hers, and there was something hard in them. Something that looked like judgment. "For some folks, yeah." Clara's stomach turned. She reached into her pocket and counted out the bills, laying them on the counter one by one. Miller took them without a word and turned away, making no move to help her carry the supplies. She gathered the bags herself, her arms straining under the weight, and walked toward the door. Behind her, she heard Miller mutter something under his breath. She didn't catch all of it, but she heard one word clearly enough. Disgrace. Clara's step faltered. She turned back, the bags heavy in her arms. Excuse me? Miller looked up, his expression defiant. I said it's a disgrace, what you did, sheltering a criminal, lying to bounty hunters. You think we don't know? You think word doesn't travel? He's a thief and a coward, Miller snapped. And you're a fool for protecting him. Your husband would be ashamed. The words hit like a slap. Clara's throat tightened, her vision blurring at the edges. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he didn't know Eli, didn't know what kind of man he was becoming. But the weight of Miller's stare, and the silence of the other customers who'd gathered to watch, pressed down on her like stones. She turned and walked out, the door swinging shut behind her with a bang. It got worse. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house and had always saved Clara a piece of pie when she came to town, crossed the street to avoid her. The blacksmith, who'd repaired her plow blade last spring and told her stories about his grandchildren, refused to take her business. Even Pastor Greaves, who'd presided over Thomas's funeral and held her hand while she wept, looked the other way when she passed the church. By the time Clara loaded her supplies onto patients and turned toward home, she felt hollow, scraped out, like something essential had been carved away and left a cavity in its place. She rode slowly, the sun hot on her back, the dust rising in pale clouds around the horse's hooves. The valley stretched out before her, familiar and vast, but it felt different now, less like home and more like exile. When she reached the cabin, Eli was in the garden, his back to her, pulling weeds from between the rows of young plants. He straightened when he heard her approach, wiping his hands on his pants. How'd it go? He asked. Clara dismounted and began unloading the supplies. She didn't look at him. Fine, Clara. She kept her eyes on the bags, her hands moving mechanically. I said it's fine. Eli walked over and took one of the bags from her, his movements gentle. What happened? For a moment Clara thought about lying, about telling him the trip had been uneventful, that nothing had changed, but the weight of the day pressed down on her, and the words came out before she could stop them. They know, she said quietly, the whole town. They know about you, and they know I helped you. Eli's face went pale. What did they say? Enough. Clara's voice cracked. She turned away, blinking hard against the sting in her eyes. Mr. Miller doubled my prices. Mrs. Henderson won't talk to me. The pastor crossed the street when he saw me coming. Clara, they called me a disgrace, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Said Thomas would be ashamed. Eli set the bag down, his hands curling into fists. I'll go. Tonight. I'll leave. And you can tell them. No. Clara, listen to me. No. She turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I'm not letting them win. I'm not letting their judgment change what I know is right. You're losing everything because of me. I'm losing nothing. That matters. Eli stared at her, his jaw working. How can you say that? Your reputation, your standing in town, are worth less than a man's life. Clara's voice steadied. I meant what I said, Eli. You're not the man on that poster, and I'm not going to let fear or shame or other people's opinions make me abandon you. For a long moment, Eli didn't speak. He just looked at her, something raw and broken moving across his face. Then he turned away, his shoulders shaking. I don't deserve you, he said hoarsely. Maybe not, but you're going to earn it. The days that followed were quiet, too quiet. Eli threw himself into work with a kind of desperate intensity, rising before dawn and collapsing after dark, his hands blistered and his back aching. He repaired the entire northern fence line, dug a new irrigation channel from the creek to the garden, built a new chicken coop to replace the one that had been falling apart for years. He barely spoke, barely ate, just worked, like a man trying to atone for something that couldn't be forgiven. Clara watched him and said nothing. She understood what he was doing, understood that guilt was a heavy thing to carry, and sometimes the only way to ease it was to pour it into something useful. But she worried that he was punishing himself, worried that he'd work himself into the ground and still believe he wasn't enough. One evening, she found him by the barn, stacking wood in the fading light. His shirt was soaked with sweat, his movements mechanical and exhausted. "Eli," she called, "that's enough for today." He didn't stop. "Almost done." "You've been saying that for an hour. Just a few more." "Eli." Clara walked over and put her hand on his arm. "Stop." He froze, his chest heaving. For a moment he just stood there, staring at the stack of wood like it held all the answers he'd been looking for. Then his shoulders sagged, and the piece of wood in his hands fell to the ground. "I can't stop," he said quietly. "If I stop, I'll think. And if I think, you'll remember that you're human," Clara finished. "That you made mistakes, that you're trying to fix them." Eli shook his head. "It's not enough. It'll never be enough." "Why not?" "Because people died, Clara." His voice broke. "Not in the robbery. After. My brother, he went back for the money, tried to finish what I'd started, and they shot him, right there in the street like a dog." Clara's heart clenched. "That wasn't your fault." "Yes, it was. I should have stopped him. Should have been there. You can't carry his choices, Eli. You can only carry your own. And what if my choices are why he's dead?" Clara didn't have an answer for that. Because she knew guilt didn't work like that. Knew it didn't care about logic or fairness or truth. It just sat in your chest like a stone and waited. "Come inside," she said gently. "Have supper. Rest." Eli looked at her, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. Then he nodded, just once, and followed her back to the cabin. That night, Clara found a letter under her door. It was folded carefully, the paper yellowed and worn. Her name was written on the outside in Eli's rough handwriting. She opened it by the light of the fire and read, "Clara, I don't have the words to say what you've done for me. You gave me warmth when I didn't deserve it. You stood between me and men who would have killed me. You risked everything. Your home, your reputation, your safety. For someone you barely knew. I've spent my whole life running from what I've done, from the guilt, from the shame, from the memory of my brother's face when he told me he was proud of me, right before he went back and got himself killed. But you made me stop. Made me see that running doesn't fix anything. It just drags the past along behind you like a chain. I can't undo what I did, can't bring my brother back, can't erase the robbery or the pain I caused. But I can stay, I can work, I can earn back what I took, piece by piece, day by day. And I can try to be the man you saw in me, the one I didn't know was still there. I'm not leaving, Clara, not unless you tell me to go, because you gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. You gave me a reason to stay. Eli." Clara's hands trembled as she folded the letter and pressed it to her chest. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. The fire crackled, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled, lonely and searching. She thought about the town, about the judgment in their eyes and the coldness in their voices, about the way they'd turned their backs on her, as if mercy was something to be ashamed of. And she thought about Eli, about the way he'd looked at her when she'd stepped between him and Cole's gun, about the way he worked himself to exhaustion every day, trying to atone, about the man he was becoming, slowly but surely, like ice melting into water. She didn't regret what she'd done, not for a moment, because some things were worth the cost. Some people were worth fighting for. And mercy, once given, couldn't be measured by what it took from you, only by what it gave. The weeks turned into months, spring deepened into summer, and the valley bloomed. The garden flourished under Eli's careful tending. The cattle fattened on good grass. The land, which had been slowly dying under the weight of Clara's solitude, came back to life. But the town didn't soften. Supplies grew harder to come by. Prices stayed high. Whispers followed Clara wherever she went, sharp as thorns. One Sunday she rode to church determined to hold her head high. But when she entered, the pews shifted. People moved, creating a space around her, a circle of empty seats, as if her presence was contagious. Pastor Greaves preached about sin and redemption, about the importance of righteousness and the danger of compassion misplaced. His eyes found hers more than once, and Clara felt the weight of his message like a stone pressing on her chest. After the service, she stood alone in the churchyard while families gathered and children played. No one spoke to her. No one met her eyes, except one person, a young woman, barely 20, with dark hair and a baby on her hip, approached slowly. She looked nervous, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid someone might see. "Mrs. Whitmore?" she said quietly. Clara turned. "Yes?" The woman hesitated, then stepped closer. "I just wanted to say, what you did was brave." Clara blinked, surprised. "I don't understand." "Standing up for that man." Everyone's saying you're a fool, but I think—" The woman glanced around again, then lowered her voice. "I think you did what was right, and I wanted you to know someone sees that." Before Clara could respond, the woman turned and hurried away, disappearing into the crowd. Clara stood there, her throat tight, her eyes stinging. It was a small thing, a single kind word in a sea of judgment. But it was enough. That night, Clara sat by the fire, Eli's letter in her hands. Outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwood, and the stars burned cold and bright. Eli was asleep on the other side of the room, his breathing slow and even. The lines of exhaustion had eased from his face, and he looked younger, softer, like the man he might have been if life had been kinder. Clara folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket. Then she stoked the fire, adding another log, watching the flames climb higher. She thought about the young woman at church, about the courage it had taken to speak, about the way mercy rippled outward, even when you couldn't see it. And she knew, deep in her bones, that the choice she'd made, the choice to stand between Eli and the gun, to risk everything for the sake of something right, had been worth it. Because mercy didn't count the cost, it just gave. And in giving, it became something more. Something that couldn't be taken away by judgment or fear or time. It became love. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain. The fire crackled, and Clara closed her eyes, letting the warmth wash over her. Years would pass like sand through her fingers. The town would continue to turn its back. Supplies would grow scarcer. The isolation would deepen, but Clara would endure. Because she'd learned something in the months since the storm. Something Thomas had tried to teach her, and something Eli had reminded her of without saying a word. That the measure of a life wasn't found in comfort, or approval, or safety. It was found in the choices you made when everything was on the line, and she'd made hers. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead. The wind sang through the valley, and somewhere in the distance thunder rumbled, soft and low, a promise of storms yet to come. But inside the cabin, the fire burned steady, and two souls, bound by mercy and tested by the world, held fast to the warmth they'd found in each other. Years passed like sand through her fingers, but the ember of mercy she'd lit in him would one day return as a blaze. 10 years changed everything. The valley aged the way land does, slowly, in layers, each season leaving its mark. The cottonwood grew thicker, its branches spreading wide enough to shade half the yard, the fence posts weathered to silver gray. The cabin's roof wore a patchwork of repairs, each one a memory of a storm survived. Clara aged too. Her hair, once dark as river stone, had gone silver at the temples. Lines had etched themselves around her eyes, not from sorrow, but from squinting into too many sunrises, from smiling at small victories, from the quiet contentment of a life lived on her own terms. The town had never forgiven her, but she'd stopped waiting for their forgiveness. She and Eli had built something in those 10 years. Not just the land, though they'd expanded the herd, improved the irrigation, turned the struggling homestead into something sustainable. They'd built a life, quiet and simple, but theirs. Eli had changed most of all. The haunted look had left his eyes, replaced by something steadier. He'd put on weight, his frame filling out with honest muscle. The scar on his jaw had faded to a thin white line, and when he smiled, which he did more often now, it reached his eyes. They'd never married, never spoke of it, but somewhere along the way the cabin had become theirs, not just hers. His hat hung by the door next to her shawl. His boots sat beside hers on the porch. At night they sat on opposite sides of the fire, reading or working, or simply existing in the comfortable silence of two people who'd learned each other's rhythms. It was enough, until the day the wagons came. Clara saw them from the garden where she was harvesting tomatoes in the late summer heat, a line of wagons rolling into the valley, dust rising behind them like a golden veil. But these weren't the rough wagons of settlers or freight haulers. These were fine, polished wood and gleaming hardware, pulled by horses that looked like they'd never missed a meal. She straightened, wiping her hands on her apron, and watched them approach. Eli emerged from the barn, a hammer in his hand. He'd been repairing the hayloft ladder. When he saw the wagons, he went still. "You expecting someone?" he asked, his voice careful. "No." They stood together, waiting, as the wagons drew closer. There were 5 of them, accompanied by a dozen riders. Men in good coats and clean hats. Not bounty hunters this time. Something else. The lead wagon stopped at the edge of the property and a man climbed down. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair and a face that spoke of boardrooms and authority. His coat was finely tailored, his boots polished to a shine. But it was the way he carried himself that made Clara's breath catch. The way he moved, confident and purposeful. Like a man who'd learned to own every room he walked into. He removed his hat and walked toward them, his gaze fixed on Eli. "Eli Kane," he said. His voice was deep, cultured. "It's been a long time." Eli's jaw tightened. "Do I know you?" The man smiled faintly. "No. But I know you. My name is Harrison Stokes. I'm a land developer out of Houston, and I've been looking for you." Clara stepped closer to Eli, her hand instinctively reaching for his arm. "What do you want with him?" Stokes glanced at her, his expression respectful but distant. "Nothing sinister, I assure you. In fact, I'm here to offer Mr. Kane an opportunity." "I don't want opportunities," Eli said flatly. "I've got everything I need right here." "Do you?" Stokes looked around, at the modest cabin, the weathered barn, the garden. His gaze was appraising but not unkind, because from what I've heard, this valley's been struggling. The town of Stanton is dying. Half the businesses have closed. The railroad passed you by, and the drought last year nearly wiped out what was left. Clara's stomach tightened. He wasn't wrong. The valley had been suffering. The town, which had never been prosperous, had withered in the years since the railroad chose a different route. People had left. Farms had been abandoned. Even the church had closed its doors. "What's that got to do with Eli?" she asked. Stokes turned his attention back to Eli. "I've been buying land in this region, building infrastructure, bringing in business. I've turned 3 dying towns into thriving communities in the last 5 years." He paused. "But I don't just buy land. I look for people. People who understand what it means to build something from nothing. People who've earned their second chances." Eli's eyes narrowed. "How do you know about me? I make it my business to know." Stokes reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. He handed it to Eli. "This is a deed to 300 acres of land just north of here. Good water, good grazing, worth about $10,000 at current market rates." Eli stared at the paper but didn't take it. "I don't understand. It's yours, free and clear, along with a position in my company if you want it. I need men who know this land, who understand the people here, men who can help me rebuild what's been lost." Clara's mind raced. $10,000. That was more money than most people saw in a lifetime. Enough to change everything, but Eli just shook his head. "Why would you give me that?" Stokes's expression softened. "Because 12 years ago you made a mistake. You robbed a bank, took $3,000, and you've been paying for it ever since." He gestured toward the homestead. "I've seen what you've built here. I've heard the stories about the woman who sheltered you, about the town that turned its back on her, about the way you've worked this land for a decade, never taking more than you've earned." He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "You've paid your debt, Kane, 10 times over, and I believe in second chances, so I'm offering you one." For a long moment, Eli didn't move, didn't speak. Clara could see the conflict playing out behind his eyes, the disbelief, the suspicion, the faint, fragile stirring of hope. Finally, Eli spoke. "What do you want in return?" "Your help, your knowledge, and your integrity." Stokes smiled. "I'm not a charity, Mr. Kane. This is business. But it's also the right thing to do." Eli looked at Clara. She saw the question in his eyes, the uncertainty, and she gave him the only answer she could. She nodded. Eli turned back to Stokes and took the deed, his hands trembling slightly. "I'll need time to think about it. Take all the time you need." Stokes replaced his hat and tipped it toward Clara. "Ma'am, it's an honor to meet you. What you did for this man, standing by him when the world turned its back, that's rare and valuable." Clara didn't trust herself to speak. She just nodded. Stokes climbed back into his wagon, and the caravan rolled on, heading toward the town. Eli stood in the dirt, the deed in his hands, staring at it like it might disappear. "Eli," Clara said softly. He looked up, his eyes bright. "This doesn't make sense. Why would he?" "Because you earned it." Clara took his hand. "You've spent 10 years proving you're more than what you did, and someone finally noticed." Eli's throat worked. "What do I do? You decide what kind of man you want to be." Clara squeezed his hand. And then you be him. 3 days later, Eli rode into Stanton. Clara went with him, not because she didn't trust him, but because she wanted to see it, wanted to witness whatever was about to happen. The town looked worse than she remembered. Half the storefronts were boarded up, the streets were dusty and empty. Even the saloon, which had always been the heart of the place, looked hollow. But there was new activity, too. Stokes's men were everywhere, measuring, surveying, talking to the few remaining townsfolk, and in the center of town, a stage had been erected. A small crowd had gathered, curiosity overcoming suspicion. Eli dismounted and helped Clara down. They walked toward the stage together, and people turned to stare. Clara recognized some of them. Mr. Miller, older now and thinner. Mrs. Henderson, her face lined with years and worry. Even Pastor Greaves, who'd retired when the church closed. Their expressions ranged from confusion to hostility, but no one spoke. Stokes stood on the stage, flanked by 2 men in suits. When he saw Eli, he smiled and gestured for him to come up. Eli hesitated. Clara touched his arm. Go on. He climbed the steps, his movements stiff, and stood beside Stokes. The crowd murmured, whispers rippling through them like wind through grass. Stokes raised his hand for silence. Thank you all for coming. I know times have been hard. I know this town has suffered. But I'm here to tell you that's about to change. He gestured to the men beside him. My company is investing in this region. We're bringing in businesses, building infrastructure, creating jobs. But we're not doing it alone. We need people who know this land. People who've lived here, worked here, bled here. He turned to Eli. This man is one of those people. Most of you know his name, Eli Kane. And most of you know his past. The crowd shifted uneasily. Clara felt her chest tighten. 12 years ago, Stokes continued, Eli made a mistake. He robbed a bank, took money that wasn't his, and he's been paying for it ever since. Not with words, not with excuses, but with work. With integrity. With the quiet, steady effort of a man determined to be better than his worst moment. He paused, letting the words sink in. I've seen what he's built, I've heard the stories, and I've decided that this man deserves a second chance, so I'm giving him one. Stokes pulled out a document and held it up. This is a contract. It makes Eli Kane a partner in my company. It gives him authority to make decisions about how we develop this region. And it pays him a salary of $5,000 a year. The crowd erupted. Voices rose, some in shock, some in anger. Clara saw Mr. Miller's face turn red, saw Mrs. Henderson cover her mouth. But Stokes wasn't finished. I know some of you are angry. I know you think he doesn't deserve this. But let me ask you something. His voice hardened. How many of you turned your backs on the woman who sheltered him? How many of you judged her for showing mercy? How many of you let your fear and your pride dictate your compassion? Silence fell like a hammer. This man, Stokes said, pointing to Eli, has spent 10 years working land that wasn't his, helping a woman rebuild a life that had been shattered, earning his redemption not through grand gestures, but through the quiet dignity of honest labor. And if that's not worthy of a second chance, then I don't know what is. He turned to Eli. Mr. Kane, do you accept? Eli stood frozen, his face pale. Clara watched from the ground, her heart in her throat. Then Eli spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried. I do. On one condition. Stokes raised an eyebrow. What's that? The first thing I do, the very first thing, is pay back what I stole. Every cent. With interest. The crowd murmured again. But this time it was different. Softer. Thoughtful. Stokes smiled. Done. He extended his hand, and Eli shook it. The crowd erupted again, some clapping, some grumbling, some simply standing in stunned silence. Clara felt tears sting her eyes. She pressed her hand to her mouth, overwhelmed. Then Eli stepped to the edge of the stage. He scanned the crowd until his eyes found hers, and he smiled. A real smile, full and bright and free. She smiled back, her vision blurring. And in that moment, Clara knew that the choice she'd made 10 years ago, the choice to open her door, to offer soup and warmth and mercy to a stranger in a storm, had changed more than just Eli's life. It had changed everything. Later that night, after the contracts were signed and the crowd had dispersed, Eli and Clara rode back to the homestead in silence. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The valley stretched out before them, bathed in light, and Clara felt something settle in her chest. Something that felt like peace. Clara, Eli said quietly, She turned to look at him. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." Clara shook her head. "You earned this, Eli. Not me. No." He stopped his horse and turned to face her fully. "I earned the chance to earn it, but you gave me the chance. You stood between me and a gun. You risked everything when you had no reason to. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." His voice cracked. "You saved my life, Clara. In every way that matters." Clara's throat tightened. "You would have done the same for me." "I hope so." Eli reached out and took her hand. "Because you're the best person I've ever known. And I don't deserve you. But I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to—" Clara's breath caught. She looked at him, really looked. At the man he'd become. At the kindness in his eyes and the strength in his jaw. And the quiet determination that had carried him through 10 years of hard work and harder judgment. And she knew, without a doubt, that she loved him. "You already have," she said softly. They rode the rest of the way home in silence, their hands joined, the valley glowing around them like a promise. And when the gavel fell, the town looked at him not as an outlaw, but as a man reborn from mercy's flame. Winter returned to the valley, not the violent, killing winter that had brought Eli to Clara's door all those years ago. This one came gently, like an old friend who knew when to be quiet. The snow fell in soft curtains, blanketing the land in white that glowed silver under the moon. The wind was calm, the sky, when it wasn't gray with clouds, stretched out clear and endless. Clara stood at the window, watching the flakes drift past the glass. She was older now, past 60, her hair completely silver, her hands marked with the calluses and scars of a lifetime spent working the land. But her eyes were still bright, still sharp, still capable of seeing beauty in the simple fall of snow. Behind her, the fire crackled in the hearth. The cabin was warm, filled with the smell of soup simmering on the stove, the same soup she'd made that first night. Carrots, potatoes, a bit of salt pork. Simple food, but warm. The kind of warmth that reached deeper than the body. She heard the sound of hooves outside and smiled. Right on time. Eli dismounted slowly, his joints protesting the cold. He was past 62 now, his dark hair gone silver at the temples and shot through with white. His face was weathered, lined by years of sun and wind and honest work. But his eyes, those storm-gray eyes, still held the same quiet strength they'd carried for the past 15 years. He'd spent those years building, not just for himself, but for the valley, for the town, for the people who'd once turned their backs and who now, slowly, grudgingly, had begun to turn back around. Stokes's investment had transformed Stanton. New businesses had opened, families had returned, the railroad, which had passed them by before, had been rerouted through the valley, bringing commerce and connection. The church had reopened, children played in streets that had once been empty, and Eli had been at the center of it all, not because he'd sought power or recognition, but because he'd understood something fundamental, that redemption wasn't a destination. It was a practice, something you did every day in small ways until the sum of those small ways became a life. He'd paid back the money he'd stolen, every cent, with interest, delivered personally to the bank he'd robbed. He'd helped struggling families keep their land. He'd funded the school when it ran short of money. He'd stood up to corrupt officials who tried to exploit the valley's revival for their own gain. And through it all, Clara had been there, not as a shadow or a helper, but as his equal, his partner, the person who'd believed in him when no one else would, and who continued to believe in him even when he struggled to believe in himself. They'd married 5 years ago, a quiet ceremony in the cabin, with only Pastor Greaves and Mrs. Henderson as witnesses. No grand celebration, no announcement in the town, just two people who'd been bound together by something deeper than law or custom, finally speaking the vows that gave their bond a name. Eli climbed the porch steps and pushed open the door. The warmth hit him immediately, along with the smell of the soup. He smiled. Clara turned from the stove, a ladle in her hand. "You're late. Got held up at the office. The new foreman wanted to go over the spring contracts, and they look good. We'll break ground on the new mill in March." Clara nodded, satisfied. She ladled soup into 2 bowls and carried them to the table. Eli hung his coat by the door, his hat beside it, and sat down across from her. They ate in comfortable silence, the fire crackling, the snow falling softly outside. It was a scene they'd lived 1,000 times, and yet it never grew old. Because it wasn't about the soup or the fire or even the cabin. It was about the presence of another person, the shared warmth, the quiet knowledge that you weren't alone. After they finished, Clara cleared the bowls and returned with 2 cups of coffee. She set one in front of Eli and took the other to her chair by the fire. Eli watched her settle in, the firelight playing across her face, turning her silver hair to gold. She looked peaceful, content, and he felt something swell in his chest, gratitude so profound it almost hurt. "Clara," he said quietly. She looked up. "I've been thinking." "Dangerous habit," he smiled. "About that night, the storm. When you found me outside." Clara's expression softened. "That was a long time ago. 15 years. Eli leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Sometimes it feels like a lifetime. Sometimes it feels like yesterday." "Which is it today?" "Both." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've been trying to understand why you did it, why you opened that door, why you dragged me inside and fed me soup and risked everything to keep me alive." Clara sipped her coffee, her eyes on the fire. "You know why. Tell me anyway." She was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. Then she spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Because I'd been where you were, not in body, but in spirit. After Thomas died, I was lost, adrift, and I didn't think anyone would ever see me again. Not really see me." She looked at Eli. "But someone did. A stranger passing through. I don't even remember his name. I just remember that he stopped, asked if I was all right, sat with me while I cried, and then he left, and I never saw him again." Eli's throat tightened. "That moment," Clara continued, "taught me something. That sometimes the smallest acts of mercy are the ones that save us. Not because they fix everything, but because they remind us we're not invisible. That someone, somewhere, still sees us as human." She smiled faintly. "So when I heard you collapse outside that night, I thought about that stranger, about what he gave me. And I knew I had to pass it on." Eli's eyes stung. He blinked hard, looking down at his hands. "I didn't know I was dying until you saved me. I'd been running so long I'd stopped feeling the cold. I know, and when I woke up and you were there," his voice broke. He took a breath. "You weren't just saving my body, Clara. You were saving everything I thought I'd lost." Clara set her cup down and rose. She crossed to where Eli sat and knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. They were rough hands, both of them, scarred and calloused. But they fit together like 2 pieces of the same thing. "You saved me too," she said quietly. "Maybe not the first night, but over time, by staying, by choosing this place, this life, even when it was hard, by showing me that mercy isn't wasted, that it grows." Eli looked at her, and for a moment, they were both young again, both standing in the doorway of that cabin, snow falling behind them, a fire burning between them, 2 souls meeting in the middle of a storm. "I love you," he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of 15 years, of every moment they'd shared, of every choice they'd made to stay, to build, to believe. "I love you too," Clara replied, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. They stayed like that for a long time, hands joined, the fire burning low, the snow falling outside like a blessing. Later that night, there was a knock at the door. Eli rose to answer it, and Clara heard voices, young ones, high and bright. When Eli returned, he was followed by 3 children, bundled in coats and scarves, their cheeks red from the cold. "Mrs. Kane," the oldest one said, "a girl of maybe 12. We brought you something." She held out a basket covered with a cloth. Clara took it and lifted the corner. Inside were jars of preserves, a loaf of fresh bread, and a small wooden carving, a bird, its wings spread in flight. "We made it at school," the girl continued. "Pastor Greaves told us about what you did, about how you helped Mr. Kane when no one else would, and we wanted to say thank you." Clara's throat closed. She looked at Eli, who was smiling, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "That's very kind," Clara managed. "But you didn't have to." "We wanted to," the girl said firmly, "because you showed us what it means to be good, even when it's hard." The other 2 children nodded solemnly. Clara knelt down, bringing herself to their level. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick. "This means more than you know." The children beamed. Then they turned and ran back out into the snow, their laughter trailing behind them like music. Eli closed the door and turned to Clara. She was still kneeling, the basket in her hands, tears streaming down her face. "Clara," he said softly. She looked up at him, her smile breaking through the tears. "They remember, of course they do. No, I mean, she shook her head, overwhelmed. They weren't even born when it happened. But they remember. The story, the choice, the mercy. Eli helped her to her feet and pulled her into his arms. That's because mercy doesn't die, Clara. It echoes. It spreads. It becomes something bigger than the people who gave it. Clara pressed her face against his chest, breathing him in. Do you think it was worth it? Everything we went through? Every second. They stood together in the center of the cabin, the fire burning behind them, the snow falling outside, and Clara felt something complete inside her. Something that had been broken for so long she'd forgotten what wholeness felt like. This was it. This was the answer to every question she'd ever had about why she'd opened that door, why she'd stood between Eli and the gun, why she'd risked everything for a man she barely knew. Because mercy, once given, never stopped moving. It rippled outward, touching lives she'd never meet, changing things she'd never see, and in the end, it came back. Not as repayment, but as confirmation. That the choice had mattered, that the kindness had counted, that the fire she'd lit that night had spread beyond the cabin, beyond the valley, into hearts and lives she'd never even know existed. Spring came again, as it always did. The snow melted, the creek swelled, the grass turned green, and the valley, which had been sleeping under a blanket of white, woke up to color and sound and life. Clara and Eli worked the garden together, side by side, their movements slow but steady. The land had been good to them, and they'd been good to it. The cycle continued, season after season, year after year. One afternoon, as they rested under the cottonwood, Clara reached into her apron pocket and pulled out something folded and worn, the letter Eli had written her all those years ago. She unfolded it carefully and read it again, her lips moving silently over the words. When she finished, she looked at Eli. Do you remember writing this? She asked. He smiled. Every word. Do you still mean it? More now than I did then. Clara folded the letter and tucked it back into her pocket. Good, because I'm keeping it. I'd expect nothing less. They sat in the shade, watching the valley stretch out before them. Cattle grazed in the distance, birds sang in the branches above, and somewhere far off the sound of children playing drifted on the wind. It was a good life, a simple life, but it was theirs, and it had all begun with a storm, with a choice, with a bowl of soup by a fire. Years continued to pass. Eli's hair turned completely white. Clara's hands grew stiffer, less able to work the way they once had. But they still sat by the fire each evening, still shared their meals, still found comfort in the simple presence of each other. The valley prospered, the town thrived, and the story of the woman who'd sheltered an outlaw and the man who'd spent his life earning redemption became a kind of legend, one that parents told their children, one that teachers shared in schools, one that reminded people that mercy was worth the cost. One winter evening, as snow fell softly outside, Clara and Eli sat by the fire. She was mending a shirt. He was reading a book, his glasses perched on his nose. Clara set her mending aside and looked at him. Really looked. At the lines on his face, at the silver in his hair, at the quiet strength that had carried him through decades of hard work and harder choices. Eli, she said. He looked up. Yes. If you could go back to that night, to the storm, would you change anything? Eli set his book down and thought about it. Thought about the cold, the pain, the fear, the years of judgment and struggle that had followed. Then he smiled. Not a single thing. Clara nodded, satisfied. Me neither. They returned to their tasks, the fire crackling between them, and as the snow fell outside, covering the world in white, Clara felt something she'd felt that first night, when she'd opened the door and found a stranger dying on her porch. Hope. Not the desperate kind, but the quiet kind. The kind that came from knowing you'd done the right thing, even when it was hard. The kind that came from seeing the seeds you'd planted grow into something beautiful. The fire burned on, the soup simmered, and two souls, who'd found each other in a storm and who'd held fast through everything that followed, rested in the warmth they'd built together. The end came quietly, as all good endings do, not with drama or fanfare, but with peace, with two people who'd lived fully, loved deeply, and given more than they'd taken. And when Clara finally passed, many years later, with Eli holding her hand and the fire burning low, her last thought was of that night, of the snow and the cold and the choice she'd made, and she knew without a doubt that it had been worth it, because mercy, once given, never died. It lived on in the valley, in the town, in the children who played in streets that had once been empty, in the families who thrived on land that had once been dying. It lived on in every act of kindness, every second chance, every moment when someone chose compassion over fear. And it would live on long after she was gone. The fire burned steady, the soup still simmered, and somewhere in the distance a new storm was beginning, one that would bring another stranger to another door, where another act of mercy would change the course of another life. Because that's how it worked, that's how it spread, one bowl of soup at a time, one fire at a time, one choice at a time. And so the fire burned on, its light spilling into the night, proof that kindness, once given, never dies. Epilogue. Decades later, a young man stood in what remained of the old homestead. The cabin was gone now, collapsed under the weight of time, but the cottonwood still stood, massive and ancient, its branches reaching toward the sky. He was a historian, researching the region's past, and he'd come here because of a story, a legend really, about a woman who'd sheltered an outlaw and changed the course of a valley. He knelt in the grass, running his fingers over a weathered stone marker. Clara Kane, beloved wife, faithful friend, proof that mercy outlasts judgment. Beside it, another stone. Eli Kane, redeemed by grace, remembered by love. The historian stood, brushing dirt from his knees. He looked out at the valley, at the thriving town in the distance, at the green fields, at the children playing by the creek, and he understood. This place, this prosperity, this peace, it had all started with a choice, with a door opened in a storm, with soup and fire, and a woman who'd believed that people were worth saving. He pulled out his notebook and wrote, "Some stories are too important to forget, not because they're extraordinary, but because they remind us of something essential, that mercy is never wasted, that kindness is never small, and that the choices we make in our darkest moments can light fires that burn for generations." He closed the notebook and walked back toward town, leaving the stones and the cottonwood to stand watch over the valley. And as he walked, the wind picked up, rustling through the grass, carrying with it the scent of spring and the promise of new growth. The fire Clara had lit that night still burned, and it always would.